Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. So this is the third of 4 classes of Buddhism in a nutshell. And basically, in the beginning part, we've talked sort of about the general characteristics of Buddhism. We've gone through the life story of Buddha. We've gone through sort of the history of Buddhism, how it spread all over the place. I'm not sure if I forget what I've said or not. I mean, it did get wiped out in India. When the Muslims came down, or a little after 1000 AD, Buddhism actually pretty much got wiped out in India, which is surprising. But it already spread to so many other countries that we have it now. But okay, so today what we're going to do, and for this class and for the last and final class next week, we're going to focus on the main teachings of Buddhism. And I'm going to try to introduce a lot of the terminology of Buddhism and sort of explain it as clearly as I can, just so when you go to other classes, other courses, you feel like you understand what people are talking about and sort of what the main idea is. And again, this is, as I was mentioning to Aaron earlier, this is sort of like an overview. This is sort of like the 6,000-foot view of Buddhism, where we're sort of seeing the big picture, and then all of the specific practices that and all of the different traditions sort of fit into this more general framework. And the biggest framework of all is what's called the Four Noble Truths. And this has always been considered the key teaching of Buddhism. This is really what makes Buddhism, I think, different from other types of spiritual traditions. And this basically defines also what was the main goal of Buddha. And so the Four Noble Truths are basically, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. And if you remember the biography that I talked about last week, the one thing that Buddha really impelled Buddha to work very hard on a spiritual path is he felt it was just terrible that people suffer. And like I say, that the actual word for suffering is this Sanskrit term dukkha, which is a little bit broader than suffering. I'm actually going to talk about the different types of suffering. So it has a broader meaning of sort of being unsatisfactory. But this is the thing, Buddha in his biography was determined that he was going to, that it had to be possible to create a life where you could eliminate suffering completely, which to many of us may seem impossible, but the Buddha claimed that he actually accomplished this. And he actually told you that you can accomplish it also. And so basically, and this notion of suffering really drives all of these Four Noble Truths, which you can think of as actually 4 spiritual paths. So the first path is the truth of suffering. And then the second path is the path of, I got to get to the right place. So the first path is the truth of suffering. The second truth is that there's a reason for suffering. There's a cause of suffering. So, and the, so as they say, the first noble truth is what they call is true suffering. The second noble truth is true cause. The third noble truth is there's a true cessation. And the fourth noble truth is that there's a true path. And the way these things work is that suffering is the thing we want to eliminate. There is a reason why we suffer. And actually, and I can explain why it is that we suffer. And once you understand that there's a reason, there's a cause why you're suffering, then that gives you hope. Because your hope is, if I can eliminate that cause, then I can eliminate suffering. And that brings you to the third noble truth, that true cessation, that you can actually have a full cessation from suffering. And the fourth noble truth, the true path, is essentially that. You eliminate the cause of suffering, and then you've eliminated suffering. So it's a very logical framework. And like I say, it's the biggest framework of which everything else fits into. And so this whole thing, I think, from a Western point of view, maybe is very strange and may take a little bit of a while to get used to it. So as I always say in Buddhism, the main thing we have to do is just sort of hang in there, just sort of relax with it. And in Buddhism, that there is this general notion that you often come up with these things that at first sound very strange or unnatural or very different than what you're used to. And the main thing is just hang in there and relax with it. Because as I said, to be a Buddhist, you don't have to believe anything. And the way Buddhism works is you practice Buddhism, you gain confidence in it. And then over time, that sort of leads you to trust all the other teachings. And then over time, you actually will have direct experience of all of these teachings. And ultimately, you will believe all of the teachings through your own direct experience. That's basically the main way that Buddhism works. And so this notion of suffering is often, the other way that they often give an analogy for thinking about this, which is helpful to many people, is they often give a medical analogy. So you can think about it, let's say you have some terrible disease. Okay, so that terrible disease is equivalent to the suffering. And then there's usually, in all of our physical illnesses, there's a cause for that suffering. It's some virus or bacteria or some bodily function that's not working right or something. There's always a cause for our sickness. And the true cessation means that in this case, I mean, in real life, sometimes we can't cure our diseases, but for this particular case, Buddha says, yes, this is a disease that can be cured. And in fact, I know it can be cured because I've cured it. And if you follow the method that I prescribed, which is the true path, so you can think of the true path as the medical treatment. So if you take the right antibiotics or whatever the treatment is, that will cure the disease. And the result will be that you will free yourself from this disease, which is essentially where we get to nirvana. So anyway, that's the main idea. And now what we want to do is sort of explain that a little bit more carefully. And so let's start with the first one. Let's talk about suffering. And part of this medical analogy is also, I should mention, that they often talked about what is the role of Buddha in all of this. And Buddha is basically the doctor. He prescribes a treatment that you need to take to cure the disease. However, just like a real doctor doesn't actually cure you, it's the treatment that actually cures you. So in the same way in Buddhism, you actually have to cure yourself by doing the practice. Which is essentially taking the treatment. It's like taking the antibiotics or exercising, eating better, whatever the treatment is. So in Buddhism, you actually treat yourself. And Buddha often said this, he says, my main role is to show you the path. And once I show you the path, all you've got to do is follow the path. And then you can achieve enlightenment or liberation. Of course, it's not so easy because the path is often goes against our normal ways of thinking and so forth, and it takes a lot of work. Nonetheless, Buddha guarantees everything in Buddhism, as I said before, is cause and effect. So if you create the causes of enlightenment, mainly practicing the path, the correct path, then you're guaranteed to achieve enlightenment. And so the whole goal in Buddhism is really, really about practice. And Buddha many times said, he talked about, my goal is to help stop suffering. It's not to give you a big philosophical treatise on how the world works. How the world works ultimately doesn't matter. What matters is that you people are suffering now and you need relief from that. You need help. And I've got the medicine that will help you achieve that. So anyway, that's the idea. So now when we look at suffering, the other thing that's helpful is it's very helpful to be more specific about suffering. Because the other way that this works ultimately is, as we will see, ignorance of how the world works is actually our main problem. And ultimately, in a very deeper sense, wisdom, the wisdom of knowing how to overcome this ignorance, is actually what achieves liberation in the end, in sort of the broad scope of things. And so, and this is where we get to these notions of emptiness and these very deep things. The key thing in Buddhism is really to see the world as it really is. And it's also to see yourself, your own psychology, your own person, how you interact in the world as it really is. And as I will talk about, we often look at the world in a very distorted way that causes us all sorts of pain and all sorts of problems. And so, and that's why Buddhism is such a practical thing, because it helps us to directly see a lot of these ways we distort the world. And then once you start looking at the world more correctly, more as it really is, as opposed to having all of these egotistical distortions, it actually helps you, even in this very moment, even day by day, moment by moment, it helps you live a better life. Because when you live life according to the way the world really works, things just work better. You don't make all sorts of mistakes that cause all sorts of suffering and dissatisfaction that's unnecessary. So the first thing to do is, I think, to talk a little bit about what suffering or this dukkha, this dissatisfaction, is. And traditionally in Buddhism, we talk about 3 different types of suffering or dukkha. We talk about manifest suffering, we talk about the suffering of change, and we talk about the deepest thing of all, which is pervasive suffering, which is actually very, very profound and deep. The easiest one to understand is manifest suffering. So manifest suffering is, as it says, just obvious, direct suffering, the suffering that you feel when you're sick. You know, if you hit your thumb with a hammer and you feel huge amounts of pain, so obvious pain, that's manifest suffering. And it can also be mental pain. In fact, most of our pain is at a more profound level, is actually more mental than physical. So anxiety, worry, all of these things are manifest suffering. So manifest suffering is what we normally think of, and for an ordinary person, feels is suffering. However, at a deeper level, Buddha talked about the suffering of change. And the suffering of change is starting to go a little bit deeper, to probe suffering at a little bit deeper level. And this is where we start sort of generalizing away from just ordinary pain to more of this notion of suffering really being dukkha, dissatisfaction. And the way that this works is, this is part of what is called the 4 seals of Buddhism. So there's sort of 4 main things that often come up over and over again that Buddha talked about. And these 4 seals are, the way it's, I'll say some of the terminology, which will sound a little crazy, but it's good for you to hear the terminology so I can explain it. So the way they usually say it is that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So what compounded phenomena means, compounded means things that are put together. And in this context, it means things that are due to causes and conditions. And that's basically our whole ordinary world. Everything in our ordinary world, the tables, chairs, our physical body, even our mental conditions, everything has causes and conditions for why it is what it is. You know, if a table is made, you have to create the causes and conditions to make the table. You have to cut the lumber, you have to assemble it and do it. And it's like that for everything. And what Buddha said is that everything in our world is impermanent. So everything in our world is put together. And if you look at it, everything in our world, you know, you can take things down to atoms and deeper levels. Everything is built on top of many different things. So everything has its components. Even our mind has many different components. Our mind has emotions, it has rational thought, it has, many different aspects to our mind. Our mind has many parts. So everything in this world has parts, and everything is put together through causes and conditions. And whatever is put together by causes and conditions lasts at this moment, because the causes and conditions have come together at this moment to make the thing be this way as it is. But the causes and conditions are always changing. And so everything changes. The next moment it will be different. So you see that our physical body grows older. Tables, chairs deteriorate, everything grows older, everything changes. Some things change faster than others, so it's more obvious, but there's nothing in this world that doesn't change. And if you think very deeply about that, it really is important. And actually, this notion of impermanence, in a way, points you directly to these deeper notions of emptiness and so forth that I'll talk about. But this notion of it, that everything in our world is impermanent, is probably, in my mind, it's sort of the most important teaching to really get. And it's important to look around your world and decide for yourself, see for yourself that everything is important. Because as we will see later, this notions of impermanence actually penetrates morality and all sorts of other conditions as well. So anyway, that's the first seal of Buddhism, that everything is impermanent. The second one is that all contaminated objects are unsatisfactory. Again, this notion of contamination means that it really has to do with, we'll talk about things like delusions and afflictions, a word called klesha that we'll get into. But basically, what it means is that everything in our life, if we look at it closely, we're going to see is unsatisfactory, meaning it has this quality of dukkha. So everything in our world has this quality of dukkha. And I'm going to talk about that. And that's what I'm coming up to in this suffering of change. But let me just finish the four seals. The third seal is that all phenomena are selfless. And this really has to do with this causes and conditions. It's saying that nothing has an intrinsic character, because if you like, everything is embedded in a situation. And the way things react or act depends on the situation they're in. You can take a simple thing like a bar of iron. A bar of iron looks like it's solid, it's very hard to bend, it's heavy. However, if you put it in a huge furnace, in a metal manufacturing thing, you can melt it. And then it has very different properties. So it's like that. So, and we're going to find out that our sense of self or ego is the same way, that it doesn't have anything permanent, but it's constantly changing. And in a certain sense, this notion of change also, I think, directly connects to this notion of everything being selfless. Nothing has an intrinsic character all by itself. And the reason why nothing has an intrinsic character all by itself is because everything in the world is related to each other. You can't isolate some aspect of the world and just have it sit out and vacuum, where it's completely disconnected from the rest of the world. And so for a thing to have its own nature, it would have to be disconnected. As soon as you start connecting things, when you connect things, that means things are influenced by other things. And as soon as things are influenced by other things, those outside things are going to cause the thing to change and react differently in different situations, depending upon what it's connecting to. So this notion of selfless is very important for our sense of who we are, that we don't have a permanent self, and that's what emptiness is ultimately about. But even phenomena doesn't have a permanent nature. And so we're going to talk a lot more about that. And the final thing is nirvana is peace. One thing we're going to learn about is that our mind is constantly agitated. And that's what these contaminations, these delusions, afflictions are. Our mind is never at peace. It's constantly filled with anxiety, worry, and other things like that. And when you achieve enlightenment or liberation, you achieve a full state of peace. And another thing that we will explore a little bit, so nirvana is peace. And part of that is also that unless you are at peace, your life is not satisfactory. If your life is agitated and you're not at peace, that's a source of dissatisfaction. So ultimately, you see how it all fits together. That and so you can see nirvana has gotten rid of all the dukkha, if you like, is the unsatisfactory. And in our current world of samsara, meaning the current world that we live in, although samsara has a little broader generalization, but you can think of samsara being just our ordinary world that we live in. The ordinary world that we live in is always unsatisfactory. And nirvana is the escape from that. And so that's our goal, is nirvana. And again, I'm giving you the big picture, but I'm going to keep adding qualifications and sort of make the picture gradually more and more detailed, sort of fill it in as we go along. So anyway, that's, again, these 4 seals of Buddhism are actually helpful because, again, they sort of give you a framework for the bigger picture. And as I said, again, the 4 seals are that everything's impermanent, everything is unsatisfactory, has this quality of dukkha in our current world. All phenomena are selfless, and nirvana is peace. Okay. So now let me go back to the second notion. So I talked about manifest pain. So now we're going to go to the suffering of change. And I should actually say the dukkha of change. Because now when we start talking about the suffering of change, we're talking about sort of this more general type of suffering, which we call dukkha, or being unsatisfactory. The reason why everything is unsatisfactory is precisely because everything does change. So these two are connected. I mean, and this is a very profound thing that is going to take a while for you to wrap your head around if you've never seen it before. But it's very important that you really understand this connection. Everything, and that's why we saw the suffering of change. So we can see this word change. Change is equivalent to impermanence. So everything changes, so everything is impermanent. And because everything does change, it is precisely for that reason that you cannot have anything satisfactory in this world. And so you need some examples to understand this. I think maybe the way to talk about it is, let's say I gave you $1 million. At that point, you'd feel extremely ecstatic, extremely happy. But then if I said, okay, you can have this $1 million, but at any moment, whenever I feel like it, I'll take it all away from you. So if I said that, then you wouldn't feel so great about this $1 million because you wouldn't feel like you really possessed it. It wouldn't really be yours. You wouldn't really have it. And so you can see how this notion of change, that you can't hang on to anything, starts to make things feel unsatisfactory because there's nothing. And if everything always changes, you can't have any trust or confidence in whatever you possess. So, and basically that's what Buddha says, you can be the world's richest person, but at any moment, everything can change as you can lose all your wealth. And it's like that for everything. You lose your health at the moment. You may think you have perfect health. Then you go for a routine doctor's appointment, you discover you have cancer and you're going to die in a couple of weeks. That can always happen. Or you can get killed in an automobile accident. Or, like you look at the stock market crash, of 1929 or whatever it was. You had these millionaires who were on top of the world, had these vast amounts of wealth, and in a moment, it was all wiped out. And at that time, there were a lot of people in New York City who were, this is before skyscrapers, when tall buildings still had windows. They were opening the window, throwing themselves out to commit suicide because they couldn't bear living without having this wealth that they'd gotten so used to. And in fact, in a certain sense, that is almost the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing of all is to have something absolutely wonderful and then to have to give it up. So to have a huge amount of wealth and then have it wiped out and then have nothing, be completely poor, and for most of our minds, it's sort of mind-boggling. It's the most painful thing that we can think of. And it's the same way with your health. Suddenly just discovering that you have some horrible disease when before that you felt great is devastating if you were in good health. And even in smaller things, you can see how this also works. And again, it's worth to actually explore this with many examples because it takes a while to sort of get used to this. But once you start seeing the pattern, then it becomes more and more obvious why our world has to be unsatisfactory. Take, for example, let's say you go to the most wonderful restaurant in your town. You have this absolutely fabulous meal. I mean, it just tastes, it's the most wonderful food you've ever eaten. And it just tastes wonderful, So in a sense, that should be a moment of intense pleasure. And certainly there is intense pleasure there. However, the problem is, once you stop eating, you're not enjoying this great taste anymore. And you can't hang on to this feeling of this wonderful taste. I mean, it's like you stop eating and it's all over. And you can maybe have a fond memory of it, but that fond memory doesn't have the wonderfulness of the actual food that you're eating. The ancient Romans actually noticed this, and their solution is they would go off and force themselves to vomit their food so they could empty their stomachs so they could keep eating. But even if you do that, if you keep eating the same wonderful food long enough, you get used to it and it starts to be boring. So if you eat something that's new and absolutely wonderful, it's amazing. But in a moment, it loses that newness. And then you start to get used to it. You start to become accustomed to it. And it's no longer as delicious. And so it's unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory that we can't hang on to this intense pleasure and have it forever. And it's pretty much like that for everything in our world. For something to be satisfactory, we would have to have it eternally, forever. We would have to never lose it. And since we can never hang on to anything, no matter how wonderful, is ultimately we're going to lose it. It's like you can go out and buy a new car, and you see these people, they buy a new car, and especially if they love cars, they're so excited. When they go to the supermarket, they park 3 blocks away so nobody will dent their car or scratch it or anything like that. But then after a few years, the car is no longer new. It's just an ordinary car. And then you go to Trader Joe's and people smash your cars to pieces. And it doesn't bother you anymore because it's an old car. And it's another example is, Christmas for young kids, when Santa Claus comes, when people are making out their lists to Santa, they're so excited about getting something and they're just absolutely thrilled. And that whole period leading up to Christmas, they're just so excited to get this special present. And then Christmas hits, Santa delivers the presents, they get it. Sometimes, if you have kids, you can see this directly. Sometimes, a short time, half hour later, they're bored with it and they just toss it aside, And so it's like that. Everything that we get can't stay new forever. And anything we get loses the thrill of the excitement when it's no longer new. So this suffering of change is really profound. And it actually has profound implications for morality. Because, for example, you can say, am I willing to commit a lot of immoral actions to get a huge amount of wealth? Well, once you realize that wealth is not permanent, and even if you get it, it can disappear at any moment, and you realize that once you get it, you'll probably be bored with it. After you have your 5th yacht, what difference does it make? You're bored with yachts. There's many famous stories about very wealthy people who are on drugs and completely unhappy because no matter what wealth you get, you're never satisfied with it. I remember there was this interesting thing, an article I read about somebody in Silicon Valley who had created this immense amount of wealth from some startup company. He had this enormous house, more objects of possession than he could ever use in 50 lifetimes, had everything he needed. He retired, seemed absolutely happy. But then he learned that somebody down the street had more money than he had, was building a bigger house. That made him so upset that he went off and founded another startup company to try to get more wealth. And that's the other problem with anything we get. We're never satisfied with it. We always want more. And in fact, that's it's an interesting nature of the world. It's the way the world really is, the way the world really works. If we go and eat some delicious food, we still want something even better than that. If we get a certain amount of money, even though we don't need any more, we always want more. We crave more. And it's this constant craving. So in that sense, we're never satisfied with anything in our current world. There's no possession that we get that we're ever satisfied with it. We always want more. And even if we think we're satisfied with it, we can't hang on to it. Eventually, it's going to decay, fall apart. We're going to lose it. The world will change its condition. It's like I remember when they were young, there used to be a lot of small grocery stores. They got all wiped out by supermarket chains. So all those people that had a wonderful life, running their own little grocery store got wiped out. The world is always like that. The world is always changing. You can't count on anything. And I think it's that fact that you can't count on anything. You can't be guaranteed that you can hang on to your stuff. That's the problem that you always have. And that's why this world will always be unsatisfactory. So there are deeper reasons also. But anyway, the suffering of change is actually very profound. And it's something that's worth thinking about and actually looking your life, looking around you. And, and the whole goal of Buddhism is to see the world the way the world really is. And this is one thing that Buddha said is a profound fact about the world, is the real problem for our world is that when you look very deeply at it, you realize you could never have true happiness in this world. Now, as we will talk about, spiritual happiness is different. There is spiritual happiness, there is bliss. And the interesting thing is that true spiritual happiness actually is satisfactory. And you can actually experience that for yourself, particularly in meditation. So anyway, that's just another interesting thing to think about. And again, it's something that you can directly experience for yourself. And that's what Buddhism is all about. Buddhism is all about, Buddha said, don't believe something because I told you. Go out and experience it for yourself and see if what I told you is true. And in Buddhism, it's believed that if we as you achieve higher and higher spiritual realizations, you will be able to see the world more and more clearly as it really is. And the truth of Buddhism will be more and more manifestly clear to you because you will directly see it for yourself. So that's the suffering of change. So this is very important. So I thought it was important to spend some time on that. The final suffering is a more subtle thing. And it's a little bit hard to explain because we start getting more and more deeper into actually the Buddhist teachings. So I will say a little bit about this more, but we will actually sort of come back to this on again and again at higher levels. And in fact, that's the other way that Buddhism works. As I was talking to Aaron earlier, in the teachings, we constantly learn something. But then as we go deeper into the spiritual path, we often revisit things and we see things at a deeper level. And so this takes time and you have to be patient and you just have to sort of keep going. But one can get a rough idea in the very beginning. And so in the very beginning, this pervasive suffering says that the world is permeated by suffering because that's the nature of our world. So at one level, at just an observational level, I've already, in a certain sense, explained this. At an observational level, we just observe that everything is impermanent. And so in an observational world, we see that our world has to be unsatisfactory because everything changes. But there's another way, a more psychological way of looking at this, which is very helpful because it has more direct application to our spiritual path. And the other way of looking at this is this notion, there's a notion that we talk about that often comes up where they talk about impurity, contamination of our lives. So this is various terminology. And I think the best way, the crude way of understanding this is the contamination or impurity in our lives really is, we're really talking about our minds. And ultimately, the most important thing in Buddhism is our mind. And I'll have to explain this a little bit more detail also, because I don't think it's so obvious in the beginning. But when you really look at things, if you want to look at your own personal happiness or suffering, it really all comes from your mind. Part of this way of understanding it is that a crude understanding is, let's say that you physically hurt yourself. When you physically hurt yourself, some people feel that pain more than others. There's some people who, God, you hardly touch them and they're just in agony with pain. They can't stand it. They can't bear it. Other people, you can practically cut off their hand and they can endure it perfectly fine. So there's this huge variation in our reaction to physical pain. And why is it? The reason why it is because in a certain sense, it's our mind where all of our suffering occurs. All of our experience happens within our mind. And if in your mind, you can sort of block out the physical pain, then sometimes you can endure it. And so, and you also see this in reactions. I can give you another simple example. Let's say your car breaks down. If you're really depending on that car, if you're going to an important meeting, or maybe you're going to a sporting event that you've been saving up all year to go to, and your car breaks down, is going to block you from going it. It's extreme agony, but there's no intrinsic suffering in that situation. The suffering all comes because your expectation is being denied. So actually your suffering is always coming in your mind. If nothing much is going on, it might be just an inconvenience. You can say, oh, well, it's just a broken car. I just have to, take it to the shop and get it fixed. It's no big deal. And there are people like that. These things happen. These little mundane things happen. Something breaks. It's just no big deal. They just go off and fix it or whatever. So what's the difference between that and the other person that's so annoyed when something breaks down? It's our mind. It's how our mind reacts to the situation. So actually, all of our suffering comes in our mind. And in Buddhism, this notion of impurity, contamination, really has to do with negative aspects of our mind. And these negative aspects of our mind are not a permanent part of our mind. They have causes and conditions that cause them to happen, and you can't eliminate them. And so to have a perfectly pure mind, which is what a Buddha would have, is eliminating these negativities in our mind. And as I will talk about, these main negativities of our mind are called, in Sanskrit, they're called klesha, and which is usually translated as either afflictions or delusions. Sometimes it's translated with either word, afflictions or delusions, depending on what type. Sometimes it just depends on what type of Buddhism you are, but the real Sanskrit word is the same word, it's klesha. And so, there's always that problem of translating things. And actually, I will come back and talk more about this klesha. And there's actually good reason for both senses of the word. But anyway, these are really the negativities, because these are the negativities that cause us to do all of our negative actions that cause all of our negative karma. So that's the other thing I'm going to have to get into, is talk about karma pretty soon. But I won't talk about it yet. Let's go a little more slowly. Okay, so the main thing is just to realize that there is this sense of pervasive suffering, and it's just the nature of our world, and it's really sort of always embedded in our mind. But it's not permanent. You know, we can achieve nirvana and so forth. Okay. And there is also part of this pervasive suffering. I should also talk about cyclic existence. So I should get a little bit into this. Let me see. I'm going to try to coordinate this a little bit. Maybe I'll come back. I'll just talk about it a little bit more. So there's this notion of samsara that we talk about. Samsara is the world that we live in. However, there is a notion of cyclic existence. And what cyclic existence means is this notion of rebirth, that we will die and we will be reborn over and over again. So there's a constant cycle of birth, death, rebirth, death again, rebirth, death again. So we're constantly cycling in this world of samsara. And as we'll talk about, this has different levels, but for now, there is this notion that we do have the cyclic birth, and this will come into this notion of karma. But again, I'm going to leave this for the moment because I want to come back to it. But I should also talk about the other standard. There's also a few other standard ways of suffering, which is very useful to think about. So the one that I talked about when I talked about Buddha's life was the suffering of sickness, aging, and death. Those were the three messengers that he met. So all three of those things cause ordinary people to experience suffering. So if you get sick, you have manifest suffering. Aging, as I'm beginning to learn as I get older, and we all eventually, hopefully we get, so we don't die young. But, you know, aging is not fun. You know, your body doesn't work as well. You tend to get more sicknesses. You know, you just can't do the things that you used to do. And it's, most people feel that aging is unsatisfactory. And the final thing, everyone's afraid of death, and we all have to die. So those are the three obvious things. There's two others that Buddhists always talk about, which I think is actually wonderful, because it's, you know, once you hear it, you say, oh, God, it's so obvious. But until somebody says it, you don't normally think about it. But the other two ordinary sufferings that hit everybody, and this really moment by moment, literally moment by moment, is the suffering of not getting what we want. And the second one is having to encounter what we don't want. So over and over again, we're constantly wanting things. And of course, you know, we don't get everything we want. And every time we don't get what we want, it's unsatisfactory. It's dissatisfactory to us. You know, it upsets us. We always get upset if we can't get what we want. You know, as we mature, we're not like little kids who literally scream and yell when they don't get what they want, react instantly. You know, we learn to control ourselves a little bit, but it's still annoying. We always get annoyed if we want something and we're blocked and we can't get it. So that's one suffering that really happens billions of times almost every day. And the second suffering is there is just naturally things we don't like. And we have to encounter those things. You know, we don't like to pay taxes. You know, occasionally we'll stub our toe. We don't like that. You know, some people have jobs they don't like. They have to go off and work at these jobs. You know, we may get stuck eating some food that we don't, you know, there's millions and millions of things that we don't like in life. And we're constantly encountering these things. And that's unsatisfactory. So that again gets to this notion of dukkha. So these two things I think are really, really quite interesting and well worth thinking about. You know, and in fact, I think it's these two things which account for probably 99% of the ordinary dissatisfaction in life. Because moment by moment, we're always just not getting what we want and having to experience what we don't want to experience. Okay. So now let's go on to the true cause. So this is this thing where we're going to get back to this notion of klesha and karma. So what Buddha said, he said, the fact that we're suffering actually is not accidental. As I said before, there's nothing in Buddhism that's accidental. Everything has causes and conditions. And as I said before, it's not just one single cause or condition. There's usually maybe 20, 50, 100 causes and conditions that are coming about to bring our current situation. So, but anyway, talking more generally, what is the cause of our suffering? If we realize that really all of our suffering occurs in our mind, it's our mind where we experience the world through, it's really these negativities in our mind. So these afflictions and delusions. The other aspect is this notion of karma. So, so the notion of karma, you can take basically as just an observation. So the notion of karma is that if we do negative actions, we will create negative karma. And in samsara, we will ultimately, eventually experience that as some kind of dissatisfaction or suffering. Conversely, the opposite is that if we do something positive, ultimately that will result in some kind of pleasurable experience later on. And these things are a little bit tricky because karma is not one-to-one. It's not like, oh, I kill somebody in this lifetime, so in my next lifetime, somebody's going to kill me. It's more that eventually it doesn't work in a one-to-one situation like that. So we talk about karma as ripening. And what karma ripens is that, so every moment we're creating karma. And that karma, in a deep sense, is what the Buddha said. It's not so much even the negative action. It's really the intention in our mind that creates the negative karma. So if you're going to kill somebody, what really creates the negative karma is the intention, the wish to harm them and kill that person. When you carry through with the action, it's like you sort of solidify that karma and make it worse, have a worse effect. But it's really the intention that really creates the karma, the negative karma. In the same way for positive karma. And in a nutshell, notions of harming is what creates negative karma. Notions of helping or benefiting creates positive karma. And there's also neutral karma. There's karma that doesn't, sometimes you just do actions and you don't really have any specific intention to harm or help or whatever. So it just sort of creates neutral karma that's neither pleasurable nor that will lead to things that are neither pleasurable nor, suffering. And okay. So I don't want to get too deeply into this, but anyway, so there is this notion of karma, and there is this notion that karma will ripen. And I think that's one thing that people forget about when they think about karma, because we're creating karma all the time. And so you can ask yourself, so if we kill somebody, for example, when is that going to ripen? And how is it going to ripen? And that's actually where everything becomes very complex. And basically what the Buddha said, for an ordinary being like us, we'll never understand it. It's just too many things going on. It's too complex. Because basically, if everything has causes and conditions, there has to be causes and conditions that cause that specific karma to ripen. And that karma can ripen in different ways, and that karma may ripen as a series of events, not just a single event. It can ripen in one way as an undesirable rebirth. So I'll talk about rebirth. So we talk about throwing karma can ripen as an undesirable rebirth. So that's one way it can ripen. So at the moment when you die, the state of your mind is absolutely critical. And the state of your mind has this huge influence on this throwing karma of what realm you're going to be reborn into. And I'll discuss this a little bit more, these different realms. So that's one way that karma can ripen. Another way that karma can ripen is what they call the environmental effect, which means that, what is your day-to-day existence? Like let's say you're born as a human, which is considered actually a good rebirth. If you're born as a rebirth, some people live luxurious lives. They're born into a life of wealth and pleasure. It's like everything seems like it goes well for them. So that's because they've created a lot of good karma, which is ripening in all of those positive ways. On the other hand, there are some certain people whose life seems like it's hell on earth. There are people that are born in, slums and, jungles, horrible places where there's huge, immense amounts of disease, violent attacks from neighboring people and tribes and so forth. There are people who it just seems like their life is just filled with suffering from the moment they're born until they die. And that's the effect of this environmental karma. So these karmas are ripened in different ways. I think the one positive thing that you should take from this is that our current state of mind has a huge influence on what karma ripens. So if you are leading a very positive spiritual life, you're going to tend to keep ripening all of your positive karma. So if you're leading a good spiritual life, two things are going to happen. One, you're going to be creating positive karma while you're living this life, which means ultimately all of that positive karma will ripen in a positive way and lead to a good result. But secondly, you're going to be mainly ripening your positive karma. And then the other thing too is there will be time to time when negative karma, the right causes and conditions will come together for negative karma to ripen. It's like bad things happen to good people because they have negative karma, and at times this bad karma ripens and they experience unfortunate results. However, if you are in a positive spiritual state, the way that it ripens may be ameliorated. So, for example, if you do some terrible action of killing somebody in a previous life, maybe it will ripen in some kind of sickness in this life. You won't experience it as yourself getting killed, but it will ripen in some lesser form. And the other thing too is that if you're living a positive spiritual life, you have to think again, there's not one single event that's causing your current conditions, but many. And if you're leading a good spiritual life, there may be some negative karma ripening, but simultaneously you will be causing other positive karma to ripen. So there's really a lot of good reasons to be leading a good spiritual life, not only for its effect on the future, but also in the present moment. It's, this karma is it's not mechanical. It's a very complex process, how it ripens and how it all comes about. And basically the Buddha said, it's so complex we can't understand it. But nonetheless, there's a really good reason for leading a good spiritual life. Plus, in addition, as I will talk about, you feel good when you're leading a good spiritual life. So you actually, having a positive mind, you feel better. But anyway, there's also these other karmic implications. So maybe I can't talk about everything too much now, but okay. So the other thing too, briefly, I want to talk about rebirth. I think rebirth is a difficult thing. For the Westerner in particular, in the East, it's easier because they have a lot of cultural things where they're sort of used to this notion. But in the West, it's considered difficult. And I think the difficulty is that we don't directly see it. Interestingly enough, the Buddha actually said that when you reach a certain level of spirituality, you will see these things directly. The Buddha said that on the night of his enlightenment, he achieved these realizations where he could directly see people being reborn in different realms. He could directly see what caused them to be reborn in different realms. And he could just see the whole thing, how it worked directly, without not theoretical knowledge, but directly seeing how the world was actually functioning. For us, at our level of spiritual development, we can't see that. So that's where you sort of come upon this faith, having this confidence. Is this really true or not? But Buddha said that, and again, he could see directly that he talked about roughly 6 different realms. I think it's actually easier to talk about 5 different realms. And sometimes he talked about it that way. So there's hellish realms where there's intense suffering. There is what's called the hungry ghost realms, where people are pervaded by suffering of unsatisfied desire in a really terrible way. There are animal realms, and those are sort of the 3 lower realms, what are called the 3 lower realms, where suffering tends to be particularly intense. The higher realms are, for our purposes, we'll just keep it to 2. Human beings, and there are also godlike realms where there's huge amounts of pleasure. And again, when you die, there is throwing karma that throws you into these different realms. And if you create huge negativities, like murdering lots of people, it's more likely that when you die, you'll be thrown into a hellish realm. If you have a lot of greed and so forth, you might have a strong tendency to be thrown into a hungry ghost realm. And again, if there's just general negativity, you can go into the animal realms. And if you create huge positivity, you can be born in these really amazing godlike realms. And again, as you might suspect, there are more people in the suffering realms than in the higher realms. It's like, as we experience in our ordinary lives, it's, for whatever reason, it seems harder for people to lead positive lives. And it always seems easier for people to lead negative lives. And I don't know why that is, actually, but it just seems, an observation. So anyway, it's just worthwhile to know that in Buddhism, there are these various realms. But again, even when you're born in a realm, your karma can influence what happens to you in that realm. Like in the animal realm, you can be born as some animals experience huge suffering. There's all sorts of ferocious beasts that eat them, tear them apart. They suffer from hunger, starvation, being thirsty. A lot of animals have huge amounts of suffering. They're slaughtered very quickly. And other animals, like some of our cats and dogs, have almost godlike existences. They're very pampered and taken care of. And it's the same way in the human realm. There are humans that have these wonderful existences where they just float through life. Seems like only good things happen to them. They have lots of money, they have good health, everything seems wonderful. And there's other people who it's literally a hell on earth. There's such intense suffering. And again, so within each realm, there's a huge variation. And it's like that for all of the different realms. So in my mind, I think a lot of people, when they come to Buddhism, they get hung up with this whole notion of rebirth. What realm am I going to go get into? And, what's going to happen? Is this really true or not? And I would say that if you're new, I would literally not worry about it, because what has become very clear to me as I've lived this Buddhist life, and I've really tried to live this Buddhist life as best I can, what's been very clear to me is that leading a positive spiritual life feels good moment to moment. And so I would say focus on that. And if you lead a good spiritual life moment to moment, you don't have to worry about these other realms. They will sort themselves out. If you're leading a good, positive life, you'll be creating a lot of positive karma. You'll be ameliorating your negative karma, the impacts of that. It's likely that at the moment of death, you'll have a positive mind, which will throw you into higher rebirth. So I would say, since we don't directly see all of these other realms, you don't really need to worry about it. Just worry about making your life better moment to moment And I think all the rest will take care of itself. And so that's my own personal way of looking at all of this. And I don't know if that's helpful for you or not, but I do find that especially new Buddhists really get hung up with rebirth and all of these other realms. And so anyway, I think I'll leave it at that, because otherwise I won't get through half of my this course. Okay, and there are, okay. So in terms of karmic actions, the Buddha actually specifically called out, it's almost like the 10 Commandments of Buddhism. You know, we have in the Christian thing, there are 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. It's basically the same thing in Buddhism. So the Buddha specifically gave 10 different examples of non-virtuous actions. So there's non-virtuous actions of body, things where you physically do things, and these are killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, where you harm somebody sexually. And there's non-virtuous speech actions, which are lying to people, divisive speech, where you use your speech to divide people up, hurtful speech or malicious speech, where you're trying to harm people with your speech, make them feel hurt. And the odd one is idle chatter, which I think has to do more with sort of gossip and sort of, which always leads to sort of negative things ultimately. And then the non-virtuous mental actions are covetousness, sort of this greed, malice, you know, thinking harmful thoughts, thinking, oh, I wish I could really harm this person in your mind, and holding wrong views, which leads you to oftentimes create negative actions. Sometimes you can have a wrong view, which can lead you to do harmful actions. You know, there are even sometimes various religions, there are, well, anyway, there's too much to get into. And the 10 virtuous actions are the opposite of these. So for example, you know, non-killing, non-stealing, and so forth, but particularly in a positive thing. But, you know, in a nutshell, basically what it all boils down to is if you're trying to harm someone, that's a negative action. And if you're trying to be beneficial or help somebody, that in general is a positive condition. And Buddhism is not legalistic. It's not that there are these precise rules that determine what's good or bad. It really is the details of the situation that matter. You know, even if something looks ostensibly bad, if it is actually helping and beneficial for somebody, then it's a good action. And if something that looks beneficial, but actually has an evil intention behind it, then it actually is a negative action. So you really have to look at the details of each situation to know whether something is virtuous or non-virtuous. You know, there's no cookie cutter set of rules that tell you. You have to really, again, like I say, karma is intention. You have to look at your intention. You know, what is my intention in this situation? Is my intention really to cause harm in some way, or is my intention to help somebody? Or sometimes our intention is just neutral, and we create neutral karma. Okay. And again, so why do we create these negative actions? We create these negative actions because of this word klesha, these delusions or afflictions. And both of them, both ways of looking at it have some reason for using these translations. In general, so what are these kleshas? It's said to be that they're the root of all delusions is actually ignorance, but that will take some explanation. But the three root delusions from which all of our other negativities come from are said to be three: ignorance, attachment, and anger. So ignorance is really just not seeing the world the way it really is. And that can cause us to create a lot of negative actions. Attachment, as you can think of as greed. You know, greed causes us to do a lot of negative things. You know, it's because of greed that you have bank robbers that steal money, that people act unethically to gain a lot of money. even though they cause other people to suffer through gaining that money. Or, greed, so basically you can think of it wanting stuff, which is attachment, greed, sort of trying to get all the best things for ourselves often causes us to harm people. We're so desirous to get these, what we think is just these wonderful things, that we create a lot of harmful actions. The opposite is anger. There are some things that we feel are unpleasant, that we don't like, and that causes us often to get angry. And what anger means in this context, anger is a mind of wishing to harm. So that's the way to think of anger. So that's why it's bad. Again, any wish or intention to harm creates negative karma. And so anger is sort of a general term, but I think that, yeah, go ahead, Aaron, you raised your hand.
Is a wish the same thing as the mental factor of aspiration?
Well, I think aspiration is usually taken in a more positive sense. It's usually, you're sort of aspiring to, maybe create a better life or something like that. Whereas this anger is really a pushing away from something. And it's really, it's said actually that there's three basic emotions, positive, negative, and neutral. And, and basically the positive emotion is sort of some type of pleasurable feeling. The negative emotion is some kind of unpleasantness. And basically, based on how we feel things, if we experience something as pleasant, we desire it. So this is what we're really talking about is positive or negative desire in this case. So we really, so in pleasurable things, that's where greed, attachment, desiring it so much that we want to sort of make it part of ourselves in a sense. We're trying to bring it to us because it brings pleasant feelings. And this negative thing of anger or hostility, whatever you want to call it, is something we experience something, some person or something as undesirable, unpleasant. And then that causes us to wish it to, this wish to harm it, push it away from ourselves is sort of, I think, the way to think about it. Okay. So anyway, these are the three root delusions. And from that, you get all sorts of other things, in terms of negative things, you get things like resentment, spite, jealousy, miserliness, deceit, laziness, all sorts of things. And, pride and all sorts of things. So you can sort of see, but the general idea is that these kleshas, these afflictions or delusions, they lead to causing us to create negative actions. And ultimately, they are tied to a sense of ego. And this is where the notion of emptiness and ignorance comes in. So again, I don't have a lot of time to cover all of Buddhism, but in sort of a nutshell, well, this is Buddhism in a nutshell, so that's appropriate. So in a nutshell, the idea of it is we think that we have this permanent self and that we can make this permanent self happy by gaining positive things and pushing away all of the negative things. And in fact, we don't have a permanent self. Our self, the state of our self at any moment is just whatever the causes and conditions brought it together to be at that moment. And it's going to constantly change. There is no permanent thing that we can make permanently happy. But we have this delusion. So here's the delusion part. We have this delusion that we have this permanent self. And we have this delusion that we can gain something that will make us permanently happy, whether it's money, sex, health, whatever it is. And because of that, we create all of these harming actions to try to achieve this permanent happiness. So that's at a very deeper level, that's the way it works. And in the same way, we feel like we have this permanent self. And if this permanent self is contaminated with anything we don't like, it's going to make us unhappy. So we try to push away everything that we feel is negative or unsatisfactory in any way. And to push it away, that sometimes, a lot of times, causes us, again, to do various ways of harm. You know, so in a sense, that's where this notion of ignorance is the ultimate root delusion. That, you know, it's really this sort of egotism. If you look at any of these delusions, they're all influenced by this sort of egotistical aspect that really drives almost all of our negativity. And so this egotistical aspect comes from this sort of root sense of a permanent self, that we actually really believe we can make ourselves permanently happier and happy or unhappy. You know, if only I win the lottery, I'll be permanently happy forever after. My life will be perfect. You know, if only I marry the perfect person, my whole life will be happy for the rest of my life, so on. You know, we're always doing this. And that causes us to do a lot of these negativities, which create all this negative karma, which causes all of our suffering. Okay, so that's sort of a deeper way of looking at it. The other thing, too, that I think is also useful to just mention is that there are other two aspects of these delusions or afflictions that are really, really important. One is that they are almost always cause some disturbance in our mind. So if you want to know, do I have one of these afflictions or delusions going on, one of these kleshas going on right now? Look at your mind and see whether it's disturbed. If your mind is disturbed, it's most likely that one of these things are happening. And again, you remember one of the seals of Buddhism, Nirvana is peace. Well, that's why Nirvana is peace, because we don't have any of these things that disturb our mind. So our mind is at peace. And it's only a mind that has a deep sense of abiding peace, that is that real deep satisfaction that really is permanent, is that permanent sort of spiritual peace. So anyway, that's one aspect of it, is that all of these things really disturb our mind. So you don't want these delusions, afflictions, because they make you unhappy moment to moment. You want to get rid of it, because if they aren't in your mind, then your mind is calm and peaceful, and you feel happy, basically. So you really want to get, you know, and in fact, one of the main works in Buddhism is really attacking all of these delusions and afflictions. That's the most practical way you can make your life happier moment to moment. The other thing, too, which is important about these delusions or afflictions, and again, this gets back to this notion of ignorance, is that they almost always involve an exaggeration, which is a distorted way of looking at the world. So if you really look at the details of how these things really work, almost always there's some enormous exaggeration going in. And what this exaggeration is, it can go, and it goes on both sides, the positive and negative. Let's look at the negative side. Well, let's look at the positive side. So let's say you want money. And so you have this greed for money, which is this negative afflicted mind, this attachment to money. What usually is going on is in your mind, you blow up or exaggerate the happiness you expect from having this money. So in your mind, you think, if only I had this money, my life would be perfectly happy, which is false. It's an exaggeration. It's an ignorant way of looking at the world. It's not the way the world really works. And you have this exaggerated notion that you can hang on to this happiness forever and your life will be perfect forever after. Or if you have some person that you want to be attached to, marry, spouse, whatever type, whatever sex, whatever, again, you build up this exaggeration of the other person, how wonderful the other person is. And you exaggerate all of their good qualities, and you tend to blow off or ignore all of their negative qualities. And you create like this perfect, like the Virgin Mary, the perfect other being that you want to become attached to. And that's why you become so attached to this other person. And again, it involves all these notions of exaggeration. And the negative way is there's somebody you don't like. In your mind, you exaggerate all of their bad qualities. You think of every single bad thing they've done to you. You make it feel like these things are 50 times worse than they really are. You ignore any good qualities that this person has. And doing that, it enables you to develop this deep hatred and wish to harm this other person. So that's, in a deeper sense, how these afflictions and delusions sort of work. So I think it's actually very helpful. Okay, so again, okay. So I'm not going to really talk more about these other 6 realms. They're said to exist, but I don't have time to go into it. And okay. And the final thing too is, what is Nirvana? So let me talk about liberation, enlightenment, Nirvana very quickly. So Nirvana means really, its initial meaning is really liberation. And the traditional words, depending on the language, in Sanskrit, you could become an arhat. I think the Pali, which is the language that the Theravadins use, it's called arahant. But basically, this means liberation from samsara, which means achieving nirvana. And nirvana, in its simplest sense, means escape from samsara. So when you achieve nirvana, you are no longer reborn in any of these 6 realms of samsara. So if you achieve this high level of liberation or becoming an arhat, when you die, you are never reborn again in samsara. And you move to this this permanent eternal bliss, if you like. In a sense, we don't know what it's like because none of us have experienced it. So we don't have any language to even talk about what the state would be. But by analogies of deep states of meditation, where people experience extraordinary states of bliss, satisfaction, happiness, and deep states of spiritual meditation, you can sort of extrapolate to how wonderful it would be. And again, if you look at it negatively, if you see these disturbances of our mind from the kleshas and stuff, and you imagine that you could permanently eradicate all of these, which is what you do when you achieve liberation from samsara, then you can sort of extrapolate how wonderful nirvana would be and how desirable it is. The other problem with samsara is that samsara karma always works. So, and all of us have created negative states. So as long as we're in samsara, we're in a state of uncertainty. Some negative karma can ripen at any point, and we could experience some suffering. So you're never safe. And it's said that for most of us in samsara, we go up and down in all these different realms. All of us have been in the God realms. All of us have been in the hell realms. And it's said that there is no beginning. The Buddha said he couldn't see any beginning to our existence, that we've been cycling forever in this samsara. So this is why samsara is called cyclic existence. We've been cycling up and down. You get better states, you get lower states, but you're never safe. The only way to be safe is to achieve the state of liberation or nirvana, where you're out of the system. Once you achieve nirvana, karma no longer works. You're permanently happy forever. So that's sort of the big picture. And again, people get hung up in wanting to achieve nirvana, in the next hour or next day, whatever. Again, I say, don't worry about it. Make your life happier moment by moment. And if you do that, you'll reach nirvana. In the Mahayana school, which I will describe what that it has to do with, but in the Mahayana school, they actually say all of us will eventually become Buddhas, every single person. But you don't want to have to experience 50 million unhappy rebirths before you achieve that. You want to do it now. But nonetheless, it is interesting that in the Mahayana Path, they say that all of this will happen. And you can ask, why is nirvana possible? Nirvana is possible because all of these negativities in our mind are said to be adventitious or accidental. So they're not part of our natural mind. And because there are causes and conditions which brought them into existence. And there are causes and conditions, namely the spiritual path, which is you can eradicate them. And in fact, through the wisdom of emptiness or selflessness, understanding that you can permanently eradicate these negativities. And when you permanently eradicate these negativities, you have a perfectly pure mind. And that's when you achieve liberation from samsara. So what's the difference now? I was talking about liberation versus enlightenment. This is a notion between what's called the Mahayana and Hinayana. So the original form of Buddhism that Buddhism taught is sometimes called the Hinayana version, the lesser vehicle. And around the birth of Christ, the Mahayana developed, which I'm going to describe, which is called the higher vehicle, the great vehicle. Maha means great, Yana means vehicle in Sanskrit. And in the Mahayana vehicle, the goal is not simply nirvana, it's not simply liberation from samsara, but it's achieving full enlightenment. So at the time of Buddha, people noticed that there were many people who became arhats at the time of Buddha. They became liberated from samsara, and Buddha would actually tell you which of these people achieved this. But these people, it was noticed that these people were not at the same level of Buddha. Buddha seemed to have infinite omniscience. He knew everything. And in fact, at one point, Buddha said, he was in a forest, billions of trees, billions of leaves. He said, you look at all these billions of leaves, think of that as what I really know. The stuff I'm teaching you is like one single leaf out of all of this whole forest. So the Buddha was saying that he sort of, basically he had this full omniscience, but achieving liberation from samsara did not give you that full omniscience. It released you from samsara, gave you perfect happiness when you died, but you were not at the same level as a Buddha. In the Mahayana school, the goal is actually to become a full Buddha, to reach the same level as Buddha Shakyamuni. And it's said that many, many people have done this. They're not recognized as the great teacher that Buddha Shakyamuni was, but many people have achieved full enlightenment. And it's said that ultimately we will. And essentially what you have to do is you have to go through some higher levels of purification to achieve full Buddhahood. And basically the Mahayana path is the goal to achieve this higher state. And the goal of Buddhism is to do this not for the happiness of having achieved a higher state, but basically because only a full Buddha can help the rest of us who are still in samsara. And it's believed that the Buddhas, even though they've achieved nirvana, are outside of samsara, can still continue to help the rest of us on our spiritual path and help us become Buddhas as well. And that's the goal of the Mahayana path. And so that goal, in a sense, is sort of implicit in the original Buddhism, but it's sort of, if you like, a stronger emphasis of one aspect. And that's this notion of the Mahayana path. Okay. So then very briefly, what I'm going to start to talk about next. So that's basically the big goal. What I'm going to talk about next is something that's part of Tibetan Buddhism. It's called lamrim, stages of the path. It sort of exists in a form in almost all forms of Buddhism, but it's a way of putting the whole spiritual path together so you can see how to go step by step through the full spiritual path from the very beginning all the way to nirvana. Because as I said, that if you create the right causes and conditions, it will take you all the way to liberation. And there is a distinct path, and there's different stages of this path, and you can work at this. And there's specific things that you can see that you need to work on. So in our form of Tibetan Buddhism, the founder of the Gelug part of Tibetan Buddhism was Lama Tsongkhapa. And he this stuff sort of existed from an earlier Buddhist teacher, Atisha, who came to to Tibet around 1000 AD, and Lama Tsongkhapa is around 1400 AD. But Tsongkhapa really put it together in a very, very detailed way. Atisha's was more like an outline. Lama Tsongkhapa came and put it together. And like I say, in other forms of other types of Buddhism besides Tibetan, they have something similar. But basically, so the idea is, what are all these steps? The first step is called renunciation or definite emergence. And renunciation is just developing the strong wish to escape from samsara and achieve nirvana. So that's what renunciation is. So renunciation doesn't mean that you're going to become an ascetic. You never want to experience pleasure again. It really is this full desire that you see how terrible samsara is, and that samsara will always be unsatisfactory. And you develop this definite determination that you're going to be liberated from it. And so what are you renouncing? What you're really renouncing is all of these negativities, these causes of suffering, these kleshas, and you're going to determine to overcome them. The second, so there are sort of three principal aspects of the path that Lama Tsongkhapa talked about. The second one is achieving a quality called bodhicitta. And this is what will bring us into the Mahayana Path, which I'll talk about. And the third is the wisdom of emptiness, which is the thing that really liberates us from samsara. And actually, it's the thing that really purifies our mind. And in the Tibetan way of looking at this thing, they actually talk about three different types of person, or three types of different scopes. Or another way of looking at it is sort of three different types of, if you like, aspirations, word that you were using before, having aspiration for three different goals, if you like. The lowest goal, which is called the small scope, is just having a happier life within samsara, which means achieving higher rebirth. It's said that wishing to just have material pleasures is the same thing that animals are, and that's not really a spiritual goal. So the spiritual goal in the small scope, or the lower type of being, is one of just having higher rebirth. And the main thing you need for that is this notion of renunciation. That's the main spiritual realization that you need. The intermediate scope, or the intermediate being, actually focuses on, this is the one where you really need renunciation. This is the one that the first one really is focused, the small scope is really focusing on karma and these kleshas, causing yourself to develop these positivities so you're reborn into higher rebirth. It's the second one, the intermediate scope, which focuses on liberation from samsara. And the way you become liberated from samsara is developing this notion of renunciation, the wish to free yourself from samsara. And then the highest scope is called the great scope. And this is where you need bodhicitta. This is where you develop this bodhicitta, which I'm going to explain. And that really has to do with this goal of complete enlightenment, so that you can help all other sentient beings become enlightened. Sentient beings mean beings with a mind. And so of these three paths, the small scope and the intermediate scope are common to both the Hinayana and Mahayana paths. The great scope is only the Mahayana path. So in the original form of Buddhism, it really just focused on nirvana. But in the Mahayana path, the goal is to remain in samsara longer, so you purify your mind more, so you can achieve this higher goal of full enlightenment that goes beyond just liberation. Okay. And okay, I will go, I'm starting to run out of time, but I'm just going to go just a little bit more faster here. I'm just going to spend an additional, I'll go over by 5 minutes maybe, to just talk about the beginning thing. So renunciation involves a subset of subsidiary goals. The first one that's mentioned is usually reliance on a spiritual teacher, a guru. In the Sanskrit word for it, lama is the word for for it in Tibetan, but it's usually considered that it's very hard to achieve these spiritual realizations by yourself. And there's a whole thing about how important it is to get a good teacher to help lead you through it. Somebody who's sort of blazing the path ahead of you can sort of show you the pitfalls, tell you when you're falling off the path, encourage you to follow the path, and sort of help lead you on the way. And that's considered very, very helpful. And it's considered a very big thing. It's also, there's a whole set of teachings about you got to be careful who you choose as a guru, because there's a lot of false gurus out there. And there's a whole way of, different techniques for trying to identify it, trying to see a person who himself actually leads a good life, is a good example of what he's leading, and who knows his stuff, for example, who really understands Buddhism. There's lots of sort of obvious things about that. So that's a whole series of which there are whole courses are giving on that, that I don't have time to get into it. The second notion is this notion of a precious human rebirth. And this is a notion that really, of all the different realms, the human realm is the best. And the reason for that is if you're in a God realm, you're having such blissful pleasure, you don't feel like doing the spiritual practice, and you don't see any reason for it because you're happy or you feel a lot of pleasure. If you're in a hell realm, you're suffering so much, you can't think of doing any spiritual practice. So you need some sort of intermediate level. And the human realm is considered best because there's enough suffering that you're motivated to lead a spiritual life. You see the benefit of a spiritual life, but you're not so blissed out that you lack motivation. So a human rebirth is considered to be the very best type of rebirth. And it's said that whenever you have a chance, like now, to obtain spiritual teachings and to follow a spiritual path, you got to grab it, because samsara is always so uncertain. If you have the circumstances to really do it, then you got to grab it. This notion of precious rebirth is really a motivator. It's telling you, grab this chance and use it. You don't know if you will get it again or when you will get it again. So if you have the chance, advance your spiritual life, because then you can create this sort of cycle where you advance, and through lifetime and life after lifetime, you advance to higher and higher levels until you achieve either liberation from samsara or enlightenment. Okay, so then the next thing is death and impermanence. So Buddha said actually that meditating on death was the deepest meditation you can do. And he talked about it as being like the elephant's footprint. Like, the elephant in India was like the heaviest animal, so it made the deepest imprint into the ground. And by analogy, which Buddha always used a lot of analogy, he's saying that, again, a meditation on death can be sort of like the deepest spiritual meditation. Because when you meditate on death, then you see how everything in samsara really has no value. So what if you have $1 billion? If you're going to die, you're going to lose it all. And so you realize this notion of impermanence. I think what it is this notion of impermanence really sinks in. And you see sort of the frivolity of most of the things that we desire. All of these things that cause us to create negative actions. You see, when you really meditate on death, they just seem so superficial. They seem so unimportant. And so it actually has the biggest impact. It makes you it really motivates you to practice the spiritual life, because it makes you think about karma and how you're going to be reborn in your next life, and that the only thing that helps you at the moment of death is the karma you've created, the type of life that you've lived is going to be the thing that helps you most at the moment of death. And so this meditation on death is just a huge, huge positive spiritual motivator. And it's true, because we all are going to die. And when we die, no matter what we built up in this life, it's gone. And when you go into your next life, the only thing you bring with you is your karma. So you'll be reborn, same realm, different realm. You'll be reborn in a different family. You'll have different experiences depending on your karma. And your life will just result from your karma. You won't remember anything of your previous life. You will just lead your new life based on the same way that our life is built up from now. You know, who we've been born to, what circumstances we've been born to, the experiences we have, sort of go into creating who we are now. And the same thing will happen in your next life. You can't bring, when you die, everything in this life is gone. And the only thing that follows you is karma. And there is no permanent personality or self that goes on. There's just this constantly changing self. So the self we have at this moment was built up of all of the experiences and causes and conditions that led us up to this point in our life. And the same thing will be true of our next life. Things just keep constant. So everything just keeps constantly changing. And so you realize that once you come to this realization, then all of these meditations on death are so deep, and they're so absolutely helpful and motivating you. And they, you know, and when you really think about it and meditate it, they lead you to very deep conclusions, and they totally change the way that you look at the world. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about now is samsaric pleasure. And I think that this is really, I'm going to talk about it because it's a fun thing to end on, because Buddha had this wonderful metaphor that I've always loved. It's one of my favorite Buddhist metaphors. So what Buddha said about the thing about samsaric pleasure is it's always dukkha. It's never satisfactory. You know, as we talked before, no matter what's good thing that seems pleasurable or good, you're never satisfied with it. You want more. You want more. You can't stand still. And so that's the nature of samsaric pleasure. But the other aspect of samsaric pleasure comes in this metaphor. And the Buddha said, imagine taking a really, really sharp knife. I mean, the sharpest knife you can think of, with the sharpest edge you can think of, and think about spreading honey over the edge of this blade. He said, trying to enjoy samsaric pleasure is like trying to lick the honey off of this sharp blade without cutting your tongue. And so you can ask, you know, well, how does that quite work? You know, what does that really mean? And the idea of it is this, is that the honey in and of itself, the pleasure, is fine. There's no problem with the pleasure. You know, you can enjoy pleasure, it's no fine. The problem is with this notion of harming, with creating negative actions. And the problem we have is enjoying positive pleasures without becoming attached to the positive pleasures, or evasive, pushing away the negativities so that we create harming or negativity. So you know, so if you can enjoy pleasure, but not get so attached to it that you create harming or negativity, then you're okay. But it's really, really hard to do that. So that's the metaphor of licking the honey. So if you lick the honey off without cutting your tongue, it means you can enjoy the pleasures that you get without creating this attachment or tendency toward negativity. So that's the tricky part of it all. So anyway, that's something that's worth thinking about that. So that's why we'll end here. It's always fun to leave you at a place where you have something to think about for next week. So next week, what I'm going to come back to, and I'm going to get into this whole Mahayana Path, the bodhicitta, and then toward the end, I will also talk about emptiness. And if I have some time, I'll talk about the Tantric or Vajrayana Path, which is actually sort of just a different aspect of the Mahayana Path, if you like, but I'll explain that. So let me just ask if there's any questions at this point. I probably overwhelmed you. The hard thing about this thing is that I feel like a fire hose. I'm just gushing all this stuff out at you, and it's, I guess, hard to, I hope it's not overwhelming all of you, but okay.
Hi, Bob. I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
And I really appreciate, you know, your teaching today. Really great. I was wondering, because I heard something, and I don't know if it's true, but Shakyamuni Buddha, that the part about him growing up in a palace is total myth?
Okay.
Or do you think that really happened?
Well, I guess the simplest explanation I can give is that when Buddha was giving teachings, he talked occasionally, not a lot, about his early life, but he himself said that he grew up this very luxurious life. And he himself said that he had these 3 different palaces, one for each type of season in the Indian thing. So unless Buddha is a liar, I tend to think that it's true. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, no, yes, it does. Thank you very much. I have one more question.
Okay.
Okay. Since we're living in degenerative times, I'm thinking about what's going on in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And that leads me to believe that this whole planet could explode with nuclear power. And if that happens, humans don't exist. So my question is, where would we go if we couldn't have a perfect human rebirth?
Okay, that's a very good question. And again, that brings me into, again, a little deeper level of detail. So that's actually perfect that you asked that, because again, my problem is I can't say everything all at once. But the other thing that Buddha did talk about is this is not the only world that exists. The Buddha talked about large, maybe infinite numbers of other worlds. And so there are humans in these other worlds. And I don't necessarily other planets, it may be even other universes. So it's a little bit unclear, the Buddha, when the Buddha talked to people, he had to talk to people in a language they could understand. And if he starts talking about something that's beyond us, maybe different universes or something like that, since we don't know anything about that, he can't really give a great explanation. But he did definitely say that there's large numbers of worlds. And I don't know, maybe different worlds in this universe, but it sort of sounded like multiple universes even beyond this one. And so, and because he talked about, actually, he himself talked about that he, through direct vision, has seen eons of worlds expanding, contracting, disappearing, being recreated, and many worlds, and having experienced this. And so the view is that when if there is a big bang, and if we come back all together again for another big bang, and we all disappear, then all the sentient beings of this universe go to other universes, and they become human beings there. And so I think that the answer is that we have sort of a limited world. We think that humans only exist on the earth. And I think the answer is that there's a much bigger universe, or multiple universes, that we have no knowledge about. But at any rate, you don't have to worry about it. There are other places you can go as a human being.
Yeah. Would it be like taking a vacation? No.
Yeah. You don't, and again, these are the things that Buddha always talked about, that he said, people always get so worried about all of these theoretical details. And, and quite frankly, we all have limited understanding. And that's not the important thing. The important thing is to worry about your spiritual life. And what the Buddha said, think about your pain and your suffering and your spiritual life. And as I say, the most important thing in my mind is try to make every single moment of your life better, happier. And that's some form of spirituality. And again, we do many different practices of spirituality. And for each of us, we have our own spiritual path that's most beneficial for us. Sometimes certain practices are more beneficial for one person and less beneficial for another. So we have to find the way. But I would say, try to make every moment of the life that you're living right now happier. so whatever spirituality works for you. And in fact, the Buddha always talked that way. He always said, judge everything by whether it's working or not. Is it really working? All right, is your life, he always used the word that they translate as wholesome and unwholesome. Is this making you a more wholesome person? Is this making you a less wholesome person? Focus on that moment by moment. And that's where mindfulness and all this mindfulness comes in, because you need mindfulness to see, how are you living right now? And could you make a better choice that's more wholesome moment by moment? And like I say, if you focus on that, all the rest will take care of itself. You don't have to worry. and moment by moment, your life will be better. You will experience less anxiety. You will feel happier, more satisfied. And again, a lot of things too, which I haven't had a lot of chance to talk about. Meditation. The Buddha always emphasized meditation. He was always telling the monks, go off, find trees, find empty huts, go off, meditate. He says, I implore you, just meditate. Because meditation is often a very, particularly, I would say, an effective way of achieving spiritual growth if you know how to meditate correctly. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. That was great.
Okay. So I'm really running over time now, so I'll have to end the session. But thank you all for staying. And so our last time will be the fourth and final class, and we'll try to get through it all. But I feel always sort of torn in this course because I want to give you enough detail so that you feel you understand it. Because if it's too abstract, then it's almost meaningless and you don't get anything. But then if I give too many details, I don't have enough time to, it makes it hard to get through the whole course. But anyway, I will all see you next week then. Thank you all for joining.
Take care.
Look